This video is for commentary and analysis under fair use. The views expressed are my own, based on publicly available information and my interpretation of it. There's a point in this section where Brad Pitt gets mentioned, and at first it sounds like just part of the conversation. But from there, something starts to shift. The focus moves away from the specific concerns people are trying to understand and toward how the critics themselves are being framed. Once you notice that, the rest lands differently.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stina. Welcome back to my channel. In many of my previous videos on hidden true crime, I talked about the shift in tone and how something just doesn't feel the same anymore for a lot of people. And in this video, I want to focus on a specific moment that stood out to me in their We Respond video, because it sets the tone for everything that comes after. It starts with that long opening about Brad Pitt, and that eventually connects to the psychological concepts John brings up later. I think that opening is doing a lot more than it appears to at first. Before we get into that, I want to briefly frame how I'm looking at this. My background is in communication, which overlaps with psychology in some ways, but it's not the same. Psychology focuses more on internal mental processes and diagnosis. What I focus on is the messaging, the language, the framing, and the patterns people use when they present information. And right from the beginning of the We Respond video, John opens with a long review of Brad Pitt's film career, eventually focusing on the period after Angelina Jolie accused him of abuse. He then pivots from that into discussion about psychological essentialism. Here's how he opens that section.
I'm going to start in a fairly peculiar, unexpected place.
Okay.
And I'm going to start with talking about Brad Pitt, the actor.
That is peculiar.
That is, it is a little peculiar, right? I don't know exactly what was going behind the scenes. I don't know if the impact of accusations was affecting his ability to get better films. And so I'm going to leave us here for a minute. I'm going to leave us with the accusations, the trajectory of his career that apparently seems to stall around 2016. And I'm going to dive into something else, which is something that's called psychological essentialism.
What he's doing here is setting up a comparison, using Brad Pitt's situation as a parallel for what happened to Lauren, suggesting both are cases of talented people being unfairly targeted by a kind of moral crusade. And from a communication standpoint, this is where it starts to break down. The two situations aren't actually comparable in any meaningful way, but placing them side by side like this frames how the audience is meant to interpret what comes next before the psychology is even introduced. From there, John spends a significant amount of time explaining psychological essentialism, the idea that people take one piece of information and use it to label someone as fundamentally bad, treating that as who they are instead of focusing on the specific behavior. What stood out to me here is how strongly he presents the concept.
One of the interesting things about psychological essentialism is that human beings, this is true across all cultures. This research is invariant. This research is as universal as you can get in our field.
He's presenting psychological essentialism almost like an ironclad rule of human nature, something fixed, universal, and consistent across people and cultures. But that's a much stronger claim than it might seem. This concept is still debated, especially when it comes to how people actually make moral judgments in real-world situations. And here it is being used to explain how critics are responding, many of whom are actually subscribers and members of the channel. And from there, he moves into applying that idea more directly, specifically to how people interpret private messages.
Let's say someone writes some private text messages with the expectation of privacy, that somebody releases a private message or series of private messages and they get out to certain people. So an example of psychological essentialism is you take one of those messages and then you develop a sticky label that you apply to the person that wrote those private messages. They will label people bad. They will label people as being immoral because of that type of behavior without looking at the context, without considering that person's history, without considering that person's life.
He never says it directly, but he appears to be referring to Lauren's private messages that were leaked, using this concept to suggest that critics are oversimplifying and judging without context. And something else I noticed here. It's not just about how this is applied. It's built into the explanation itself.
So the issue isn't only that he presents the concept as broad or universal. It's also that he presents it in third-person language, which makes it sound objective while subtly placing the viewer inside that explanation. He says things like people tend to and psychological essentialism suggests, which makes it sound like an objective description of human behavior rather than one interpretive framework.
So instead of saying you might be interpreting this a certain way, it becomes this is how people think. And when that's presented as something universal or invariant, as John said, it can start to feel less like one possible framework and more like a fixed explanation for what is happening. And this is the same moment I mentioned in my last video, the part that really stood out to me. Because when you start framing criticism in psychological terms like this, it shifts the focus away from the behavior being discussed and onto the people reacting to it. And that's where it can become a problem. When disagreement is framed as something like emotional bias or irrational thinking, it becomes much easier to dismiss it altogether. At that point, the conversation isn't about the behavior anymore. It's about discrediting the reaction to it. But there is a middle ground here that gets completely skipped. Most adults understand that you can look at specific actions, expect accountability, and still not reduce someone to being an inherently bad person. In other words, you don't have to label someone as a bad person to say that a particular behavior wasn't okay. And that's really where the issue comes in, because John's framing skips right over the middle ground. It moves from explaining behavior to explaining away the reactions to it. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. Did you notice this pattern too? Do you see the Brad Pitt comparison and the psychological essentialism discussion as fair analysis or as a form of deflection? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoy this kind of deeper pattern breakdown, make sure you're subscribed and the notification bell is on. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.